The Sentinel drifted through the void of space, its sensors scanning the black expanse of the Orion Nebula. Captain Ilara Knox stood at the command deck, her gaze fixed on the swirling mass of gas and starlight outside the reinforced glass. The stars were distant, scattered pinpricks of light that seemed almost indifferent to the hum of her ship's engines. Yet, in the silence of space, there was always something that caught her attention. A shift. A whisper of something that should not be there. She felt it in her bones, a sense that the universe was holding its breath. Her first officer, Lieutenant Michael Ward, sat at the communication console, his fingers flying over the holographic interface. The station had been quiet for days, routine scans, nothing to report. But then, just before the shift change, something strange happened. A weak signal, buried beneath the usual cosmic background noise, had appeared on their radar, faint but unmistakable. It was human. "Captain," Ward's voice cut through her thoughts, laced with a mixture of intrigue and concern. "You need to see this." Ilara turned, stepping toward the station. The signal was odd, fragmented, as if something, or someone, was trying to reach out, but the transmission was badly damaged. Faint bursts of static broke through every few seconds. It was more than just a random signal. This was deliberate. Someone, or something, had sent this message. "What do we have?" she asked, her voice calm, though her heart was beginning to race. "It's human," Ward replied, narrowing his eyes as he adjusted the frequency. "It's coming from a planet, in a previously uncharted system. At least, it wasn't on any Earth records." Ilara's brow furrowed as she stared at the data. How long ago was this message sent? "Centuries ago," Ward said, his fingers tapping the console. "The signal's not fresh, Captain. It's ancient." Her thoughts flickered back to Earth's golden age of exploration, when humanity had first reached beyond the Sol system. During the Exodus, Earth had sent out colonies across the stars, some well documented, others kept hidden. The worst of those were abandoned, left behind to rot in silence. Could this be one of them? "Course correction, now," Ilara ordered, her voice sharp. "Set a course for the signal source." "Ready to jump," Ward responded, his fingers hovering over the controls. The Sentinel lurched as the ship's jump drive powered up, the engines singing a low hum as they prepared to breach the fabric of space. In mere moments, the ship would leap across light years, propelled by the power of humanity's greatest technological achievement. Ilara clenched her fists around the armrest, feeling the familiar rush of acceleration as the stars stretched and then snapped into stillness. They had entered a new system, one that had been completely off their radar until now. "Landing coordinates locked," Ward said, breaking the tense silence. "Preparing to descend." As the ship began its descent toward the planet below, Ilara couldn't shake the feeling of unease that gnawed at her. There was something about this whole situation that didn't feel right. The signal, the forgotten colony, the feeling of something buried in the dark corners of space. She glanced out the viewports. An eerie red glow bathed the surface of the world below, an unsettling hue that hinted at something more than just an abandoned settlement. She knew that whatever awaited them on this planet, it would not be as simple as a rescue mission. There were secrets here, hidden in the ruins of a forgotten past. And secrets, Ilara knew, had a way of finding the light, whether they were ready or not. "Get ready, everyone," she said, her voice steady despite the rising tension in her chest. "We don't know what we're walking into." The Sentinel dropped through the atmosphere, slicing through layers of clouds as the rocky, barren landscape came into view. Jagged mountains, sprawling deserts, and strange geometric structures that seemed far too precise to be natural. And in the distance, just beyond a ridge, there it was, the colony's remains, sprawling and silent. A forgotten world, holding its breath. As they touched down, the air seemed still, unnervingly still, as if the very planet was watching them. Ilara didn't know what was waiting for them, but she could feel the weight of something ancient and powerful stirring in the dark corners of the colony. and she had the creeping sense that this mission was just the beginning. The Sentinel settled on the cracked, red soil of the desolate planet, its landing gear screeching against the rugged surface. The hum of the engines powered down, leaving only the eerie silence of the colony's remains to fill the air. Captain Illara Nox stood, her boots solid on the deck of the ship, surveying the planet's uninviting surface through the viewing windows. The wind was strangely absent, the landscape devoid of any movement, except for the occasional gust of dust. The vast silence pressed in around them, as if the entire planet was holding its breath. "All systems are nominal," Ward reported from his station, his eyes scanning the readouts. "We're grounded." Illara nodded but didn't move. She was lost in thought, wondering what had once thrived here. Why had this place been hidden from humanity's records? And why was there no sign of life, despite the human signal they had received? Something about the situation didn't sit right with her, gnawing at the back of her mind. It was too quiet. "We're going in," she said, her voice unwavering. "Prepare the team for an exploration mission. Keep comms open, and don't stray too far from the ship. We stick together." Her crew nodded, already donning their gear in the cargo hold. The air outside was breathable, but they would need suits to navigate the unknown terrain and protect themselves from the harsh elements. As they geared up, Illara gave one last look at the signal's coordinates. The colony's location was marked deep in the heart of a vast, ruined city. There were remnants of buildings visible through the haze, their outlines jagged and broken, casting long shadows across the land. Whatever had happened here, it had left this world in ruins. The team gathered outside the Sentinel in a tight formation, scanning the horizon. Their steps crunched through the dry, cracked earth as they moved toward the decaying structures. The air smelled faintly of metal and decay, but there was something else beneath it, a sharpness that hinted at something unnatural. "It's too quiet," said Lieutenant Cassidy, the youngest member of the crew, her voice tight with unease. "No animals, no sounds, just emptiness." Illara could feel it too, the oppressive stillness that hung in the air, suffocating and alien. They moved forward, their boots kicking up dust as they approached the first of the ruins. The structures that had once been homes, laboratories, or perhaps living spaces were now little more than crumbling husks, their walls cracked and etched with strange symbols that didn't belong to any human language Illara knew. "What are these markings?" Lieutenant Ward asked, his eyes narrowing as he examined a series of symbols carved into a fallen pillar. The language was unfamiliar, its shapes intricate, almost alien in design. "Could be some kind of local art," Illara suggested, but she felt a growing unease in her gut. Everything about this place felt off. The ruins were too advanced for a colony lost so long ago, and these markings, they didn't look like the remnants of Earth's old colonies. As they ventured deeper into the heart of the city, they came across something that made the hairs on the back of Ilara's neck stand on end. An enormous structure, a towering edifice that stood apart from the surrounding ruins. Unlike the others, this building was pristine, its surface untouched by time. The stone was black, smooth, and unweathered, as if it had been built only yesterday. At its base stood an archway, like a door to another world. But there was no handle, no way in. "Illara," Ward's voice trembled. "This doesn't feel like anything we've seen before. This is alien." Before Illara could respond, something shifted. An unnatural breeze whispered through the air, carrying with it an echo. It wasn't wind. It wasn't natural. The sound was a voice, faint, distant, like a whisper calling to them from the very depths of the structure. "Is anyone else hearing that?" Ward asked, his voice barely audible over the low hum that had begun vibrating the air around them. The voice grew louder, clearer, until the words became distinct. "Welcome. You are not alone." The message, transmitted through the air itself, sent chills down Ilara's spine. The voice was human, but there was something wrong with it, something alien about its tone. The crew froze in place, exchanging nervous glances, unsure of what they were hearing. "Stay alert," Ilara commanded, her voice firm. "Move forward and stay close." They approached the archway, the voice still echoing in their minds. Every step they took seemed to draw them deeper into the strange mystery that this colony had become, and with each step, Ilara felt the weight of something ancient pressing down on her, a presence that had been waiting for them, a presence that had known they were coming long before they ever arrived. The archway stood like an ancient sentinel, its smooth black surface gleaming in the harsh light of the planet's dying sun. The whispering voice still reverberated through the air, almost as if the very ground beneath their feet were alive with energy. As Ilara and her crew stood before the entrance, they couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching them. Something far older than humanity, something with a deep and unsettling intelligence. Ilara motioned for the team to proceed, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the sense that they were crossing into a place where they didn't belong. With every step, the strange hum in the air grew louder, like the pulse of an enormous heart deep beneath the surface. The silence around them felt unnatural, a stillness that was almost suffocating. "I don't like this, Captain," Lieutenant Cassidy whispered, her voice tense with fear. "This place, it's not just a colony. It's something else." Ilara didn't respond immediately. She was too focused on the entrance, too focused on what lay ahead. The voice they'd heard earlier seemed to grow stronger with each step they took, but it wasn't just in their ears anymore. It was in their minds, seeping into their thoughts like a slow poison. She felt a chill crawl up her spine as the air grew heavier, thick with a kind of invisible weight. The energy was unmistakable now, psychic, foreign, and all-encompassing. As they crossed the threshold, the world around them seemed to warp. The walls inside the structure were smooth and featureless, glowing faintly with an ethereal light that seemed to pulse in time with their own heartbeats. The floor was made of a dark, polished material, almost metallic, reflecting the faint glow of their helmets' lights. But it was the center of the chamber that drew their attention, a large circular platform surrounded by intricate symbols, glowing softly, as though waiting. The whispering voice had become more distinct, no longer just a faint echo. It was speaking directly to them now, a soft, melodic hum that threaded through their minds. The words were alien, but the meaning was clear. "You have come to awaken us." Cassidy shook her head. This is insane. It feels like the place itself is talking to us." Before Ilara could respond, Dr. Samuel Axton, who had been strangely silent since they entered the ruins, stepped forward. His eyes were wide with recognition, and his expression was a mixture of awe and fear. "This is it," he murmured, almost to himself. "This is where it all began." Ilara's gaze snapped to him, her heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean, where it all began?" Axton looked around, his eyes wide as if seeing something beyond the visible. This colony, Aurelia, it wasn't just a settlement. It was an experiment. We were the test subjects. He paused, swallowing hard, then turned to face the crew. "We weren't sent here to colonize. We were sent here to transform, to evolve." The project was supposed to give humanity the power to survive anywhere in the universe, to become something more than human. Something connected. Ilara's mind raced. This wasn't just an isolated colony. It was a lab, a breeding ground for something far more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. "Transform how?" she asked, her voice tense. Axton took a shaky breath. The colony's inhabitants, they were modified, genetically, psychically. The aim was to create a new type of human, one capable of linking with the environment, of merging with it, of becoming one with the planet. But it went wrong. His voice faltered. "We lost control. The psychic bonds we created, they didn't just connect us to the planet. They connected us to something else, something ancient, something alive." At that moment, The room seemed to pulse in response to his words. The symbols on the floor flared brighter, and Ilara's breath caught in her throat as a sudden force washed over her, pressing against her mind. A strange, foreign sensation filled her head, like the entire planet was alive, its thoughts brushing against her own. "Get out!" Axton suddenly screamed. "It's waking up. We're waking it up. You don't understand. You're not ready." But it was too late. The chamber shuddered, and the ground beneath them rumbled. A deep, resonating voice, the same one they had been hearing, echoed in their minds, louder now, clearer than ever. "The time has come. Welcome home." The symbols on the floor shifted, swirling in a rapid pattern, as the air thickened with a new kind of energy. Ilara's team staggered back, their heads pounding with the force of the psychic wave. Suddenly, the walls around them seemed to distort, bending and twisting as though they were made of liquid, not stone. The chamber was no longer just a room. It was a living, breathing entity, and it was waking up. The true purpose of Aurelia, the reason this place had been hidden from Earth's records, was unfolding before their eyes. And they were no longer just visitors. They were part of the experiment now. The tremors from the psychic pulse reverberated through the very bones of the crew, as if the planet itself was speaking directly to their souls. Ilara staggered, gripping the nearest wall to steady herself. The air was thick, dense with a presence that pressed against her thoughts, forcing her to fight to retain control over her own mind. "Captain," Ward shouted, his voice panicked as he clutched his helmet, his hands trembling. "What is happening? I can't think clearly. It's inside my head." Ilara's vision blurred, the walls of the chamber folding in on themselves. The room felt alive, breathing. The symbols on the floor pulsed with an otherworldly light, sending waves of energy through the crew. It was as if the planet's ancient consciousness was reaching out to them, trying to make a connection, or perhaps a takeover. Axton stumbled toward Ilara, his face contorted in fear and recognition. "It's happening. It's waking up inside all of us. The psychic bond. It's not just with the planet. It's with it, the thing that lives beneath us. We're becoming part of it. The colony. It's a conduit." Ilara shook her head, trying to push past the overwhelming dizziness. "What are you talking about, Axton? Who is the colony connected to? What's down there?" Before Axton could answer, a low, guttural hum filled the air, cutting through the chaos of her thoughts. It wasn't the same whispering voice from earlier. It was deeper, more resonant, almost predatory. And then, suddenly, an image flashed in her mind. A vast, organic mass, something that defied comprehension. It was alive, yes, but it was also ancient, colossal, stretching beneath the entire surface of the planet. A sentience that had existed long before humanity ever reached the stars. The realization hit Ilara like a slap across the face. The psychic energy flooding the room was not simply a remnant of the colony's failed experiments. No, this force was connected to something far older, far more powerful. Aurelia was not just a colony, it was a prison, a containment site for an entity that had been dormant for eons. The colonists had not merely been modified, they had been enslaved to this entity's will. "Everyone, stay focused." Ilara snapped, her voice cutting through the growing dissonance in her mind. She could feel her crew slipping away from her, their will crumbling as the psychic waves continued to batter their minds. Ward's eyes were wide with terror. It's in my head. It wants me to join it. I can hear it. I think it's me." Ilara moved toward him, but before she could reach him, he staggered backward, his face contorting as if struggling against some invisible force. I don't know who I am anymore, Captain. I feel like I'm part of it, part of everything." A shudder ran through Ilara's spine. Ward was losing himself, becoming one with the entity beneath the surface, just as Axton had warned. She could feel it too, the pull like 1,000 voices whispering at once, each one beckoning her into the dark abyss of the planet's mind. "Ward, fight it," Ilara shouted, but her voice felt distant, muffled, as if the words were being swallowed by the planet itself. Axton took a step forward, his face pale. "We don't have much time. The entity has already started its work. The psychic link will be irreversible if we don't sever it now. We have to reach the core before it fully awakens." Before Ilara could ask how to do that, the ground beneath them began to shake violently. The chamber quivered, and a low rumble echoed from deep below the surface, as if the entity beneath was stirring, stretching, waking from a long slumber. "Move, now," Ilara barked, grabbing Ward by the shoulder and pulling him toward the door. But Ward didn't respond. His eyes were vacant, lost in the sea of voices that now controlled him. A sudden, jarring pulse of psychic energy exploded through the chamber. Ilara screamed in pain as her mind was flooded with visions, floods of images that weren't her own, memories of the colony's inhabitants long gone. There were flashes of scientists, of experiments gone wrong, of people whispering words she couldn't understand. A feeling of immense loss, a fear so deep it nearly consumed her. "Don't let it take you," Axton yelled, his voice nearly drowned out by the psychic assault. The colony's experiments, the modifications, they turned everyone into part of the hive mind. They lost themselves, one by one. Ilara fought to push through the waves of foreign emotions, clinging to the last vestiges of her own identity. She could still feel the others, but it was growing harder to distinguish herself from them. She had to act, and fast. Grabbing Axton's arm, Ilara forced her way toward the exit, shaking off the terrifying visions of colonists who had long since ceased to be human. Whatever this entity was, it was powerful. It wanted to consume, to merge them all into its collective mind, to erase their individuality. She couldn't let that happen. "Keep moving," she ordered, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "We need to reach the core, before it reaches us." But even as she spoke, Ilara could feel the entity's presence growing stronger. It wasn't just in her mind anymore. It was in the very walls. The air, the ground beneath her feet, it was all around them. And it was getting closer. Ilara's boots pounded against the cracked floor as she dragged Ward forward, her mind racing. The psychic pulse had subsided for the moment, but the heavy weight of the entity's presence still pressed on her, suffocating and relentless. Ward's eyes, wide and glazed, seemed vacant, empty windows to a mind lost to something far darker than any of them had prepared for. His body moved mechanically, as though driven by a force beyond his control. "Stay with me, Ward," Ilara whispered, even though she knew he couldn't hear her. Not anymore. He was slipping away, becoming part of the hive. Her grip tightened on his shoulder, but there was no response, no recognition. Axton moved ahead, his pace quickening, his eyes wild with the urgency of his thoughts. "This way," he shouted, leading them down a narrow corridor that seemed to spiral deeper into the bowels of the structure. The walls around them began to hum once more, the strange energy vibrating through the air like a low, resonating chant. The symbols that had once seemed so alien to Ilara now pulsed with an eerie rhythm, a warning and a promise. "Join us," it echoed in her mind, a deep, insistent voice laced with ancient hunger. She shuddered, shaking the thought from her head. She had to focus. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, its dark walls closing in on them. Ilara's breath came faster now, her steps more frantic. The rumblings from below had intensified. The very ground seemed to tremble beneath her feet, as though the planet itself was shifting, preparing for something monumental. "There!" Axton shouted, stopping abruptly at a large circular door set into the stone. The door was unlike any they had encountered before. It shimmered with a silvery energy, its surface alive with pulsing veins of light. The patterns resembled the symbols that had been carved into the walls, but more complex, more intricate, like a living map of something vast and unknowable. Ilara didn't hesitate. She moved forward, slamming her palm into the door's center, feeling the energy push against her skin. It resisted at first, the light flickering and dimming as if sensing her touch, but then, with a deep, resonating hum, the door parted slowly, revealing a massive chamber beyond. The room was vast, stretching far beyond the reach of their lights. At the center of it all stood an enormous black obelisk, a towering spire that seemed to pulse with life. The air in the room was thick with energy, a hum so powerful it was almost physical. The obelisk glowed faintly, casting an eerie blue light that filled the space. But it was the floor beneath it that caught Ilara's attention, an intricate, massive symbol, its lines forming a web that seemed to link everything together. The same symbol she had seen throughout the ruins. "This is it," Axton breathed, his voice barely audible over the humming. "This is the heart of it, the core of the entity's power." Ilara's pulse quickened as she took in the sight before her. The obelisk was no ordinary artifact. It was a focal point, a conduit for the entity's will, and it was drawing them closer with every passing second. She could feel the pull now, stronger than ever. The energy in the air seemed to tighten, like a noose around her mind. The entity was here, inside the obelisk. And it wasn't just reaching for her, it was reaching for all of them. "We have to destroy it," Ilara said, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "Axton, tell me how." Axton's face was pale, his eyes darting to the obelisk as if he could already see the answers in its glowing surface. The colony, the experiment wasn't just about connection. It was about control. The obelisk, it's the anchor. If we destroy it, we sever the entity's hold on the planet. But how do we destroy something like that? Ward's voice broke through, hoarse and distant. His eyes were still vacant, but there was something darker now, an eerie calm that made Ilara's skin crawl. He had stopped resisting, and she could feel him slipping further into the hive, his consciousness merging with the entities. Axton seemed to hesitate, his mind racing with calculations Ilara couldn't follow. "There's a sequence, a frequency, encoded in the symbols. If we activate it in the right order, it should destabilize the obelisk, break its connection. But the risk is high. If we fail..." He trailed off, and Ilara could see the truth in his eyes. "If we fail, it'll complete the link, and we'll all be part of it forever." Ilara swallowed hard, fighting against the terror that rose in her throat. The weight of the decision hung heavy, but there was no choice. If they didn't act now, the entire galaxy would fall under the control of this entity. "We don't have a choice," she said, her voice steely. "We'll do it together. We will break it." She moved forward, knowing that the moment they triggered that sequence, the planet would either be free, or it would consume them all. The air in the chamber grew thick, charged with an energy that felt almost alive. Every step Ilara took toward the obelisk made her feel as if the walls themselves were closing in, the pressure building in her chest with every breath. She glanced back at her team. Ward's body stood motionless, his face a hollow mask, eyes glazed over as if he were already lost to the entity. Axton, too, was visibly shaken, his eyes darting to the glowing obelisk as if its pulse had become his heartbeat. "Focus," Ilara commanded, though her own thoughts were slipping. The pull of the obelisk was undeniable, like the promise of sweet, dark relief from everything, offering an end to the pain of resistance. Axton's voice was a whisper, his words filled with dread. "The sequence is embedded in the floor symbols. They're shifting. We have to decode them before they reset. If we wait too long, the entity will regain control completely." Ilara nodded, though she could barely understand the gravity of his words. Her head was already swimming, each breath thickening in the mental fog that clouded her thoughts. She could feel the obelisk calling to her now, beckoning her to release her mind, to let it flow into the collective. The symbols beneath their feet were alive, their glowing lines swirling and shifting in complex patterns. Ilara crouched, her eyes locking on the central figure, an intricate geometric design formed from the web of symbols. In the center was a singular point, glowing more brightly than the rest. A nexus. If she could activate that, it would destabilize the connection. A break in the cycle. Freedom. But the symbols shifted again, moving faster now, as if testing her resolve. "Captain," Axton said, his voice strained, "you need to focus on the sequence. If I'm right, it's tied to the pattern of the energy flow from the obelisk. We need to trigger it at the right moment." Ilara's hands trembled, but she reached out toward the symbols, feeling the cold energy ripple through her fingers. Every touch sent another wave of psychic static through her mind, as if the entity were testing her, pushing her back, forcing her to submit. Her vision blurred, a flickering of dark shadows encroaching at the edges of her perception. She could feel Ward behind her, his presence like a faint echo, his body tethered to the hive. His voice murmured, something faint, a distant plea. "Ilara." She flinched, feeling the weight of his voice in her mind, his soul reaching out to her, or perhaps the entity using him to speak. It was hard to tell now. Ward wasn't himself anymore. He was part of the system, a thread in a massive web. She couldn't let that be her fate. She couldn't become part of the hive. Her fingers hovered over the central symbol, just a hair's breadth away from activating it when the ground beneath her shifted again, this time violently. The chamber trembled, and a deep, rumbling growl vibrated the very air. The obelisk flared with a blinding light, its power surging, and suddenly, Ilara could see it. The entity beneath the surface. Its consciousness was vast, an ocean of memories and thoughts stretching beyond time, hungry for more. It saw her. It felt her. "Join us, Ilara." The voice echoed in her mind, soft, seductive, promising her strength, power, release. For a moment, she was paralyzed. The pull was overwhelming. The obelisk was calling, and it felt like the only thing that made sense. She could feel the warmth of it, the promise of unity, of no longer being alone, of being part of something eternal. But then, something sharp and cold pierced her thoughts. Axton's voice, frantic. "Ilara, don't listen to it. You have to fight it. The sequence. The sequence. Now." With a jolt, Ilara snapped back to reality, the fog clearing just enough for her to see the symbols once more. The obelisk was feeding off her hesitation, amplifying her doubts. She had to end it. There was no time for anything else. No time for weakness. Steeling herself, she pressed her palm against the central symbol. The moment she did, a violent surge of energy pulsed through her body, almost knocking her off her feet. Her mind screamed, her senses overwhelmed, as if she had just touched the heart of the sun. The floor beneath her feet cracked, and a sudden flash of light illuminated the entire chamber, blinding her. The room shifted. The walls trembled. But as the energy continued to pulse from the obelisk, something unexpected happened. The entity's grip on her mind loosened. The fog receded. The whispering voices faded to a distant murmur, like the last remnants of a forgotten dream. "Ilara." Ward's voice sounded again, weak, but this time it wasn't laced with the entity's command. It was his own. She turned to see him standing there, his posture stiff, but his eyes were his own. For a moment, they locked gazes, a fleeting recognition passing between them. He was still in the grip of the entity, but the link had been damaged. Ilara gritted her teeth, summoning the last of her strength. If they were going to survive this, they had to finish it now. The final piece of the sequence, the last of the symbols, was still faintly glowing. "Axton, help me. We're almost there." Axton nodded, moving to her side as the air crackled with tension. It was now or never. The entity was reeling, its connection to the obelisk beginning to fracture. But how long would it last? They didn't have much time. With a deep breath, Ilara reached out one final time and activated the sequence. The moment Ilara activated the final symbol, the entire chamber seemed to explode in light. The obelisk pulsed with a violent force, and the ground beneath them trembled so violently that Ilara had to brace herself against the shockwave. The energy coursing through the room was unlike anything she had ever experienced, a power that felt primal, ancient, and incomprehensibly vast. The air was thick with static, the very atmosphere warping as if reality itself were bending to the will of the entity. For a split second, Ilara felt like she was falling, like the floor had disappeared beneath her feet, and she was plummeting into the void. A scream ripped from her throat, but it was drowned out by the deafening roar of the obelisk. Her mind reeled from the onslaught of psychic energy. Memories, images, emotions that weren't her own flooded her consciousness, threatening to break her apart. Join us. Become one with the hive. She fought to keep control, to hold on to herself, but the voices, millions of them, scratched at the edges of her sanity. Her thoughts were not her own. She was no longer Ilara. She was part of something much greater, much darker. The line between her identity and the entity began to blur. But then, just as the weight of the invasion became too much to bear, she felt a presence, Axton. He was beside her, his hand gripping her arm, pulling her back from the abyss. Ilara. Axton's voice cut through the haze, sharp and clear. Focus. It's cracking. We're tearing it apart. You can still fight. His words were like a lifeline. Ilara clung to them, forcing herself to remember who she was. Ilara Reyes. She wasn't the entity. She was human. She could resist. Her hand, still pressed to the symbol, trembled. The light from the obelisk intensified, searing her skin as if it were burning her from the inside out. She wanted to pull away, to give in to the pain, but she couldn't. Not now. With every ounce of willpower she had left, Ilara pushed back against the pull of the hive. She focused on Axton, on the mission, on the people she had left to save. There was no turning back now. The ground trembled again, harder this time, and a low rumble filled the air. It felt like the planet was crying out, as if it too was struggling to break free from the entity's grip. And then, with a deafening crack, the symbols on the floor shattered. The obelisk flared one last time, its glow reaching blinding levels, before it collapsed inward, the energy collapsing on itself in a violent implosion. The air around them seemed to twist and distort, warping in ways that defied physics, before everything went still. The hum of the energy ceased. The voices, the whispers, the overwhelming presence of the entity, all of it was gone. Ilara gasped, falling to her knees, the weight of the psychic backlash sending her reeling. The world around her felt distant, as if she were detached from reality. For a moment, she thought she might pass out, but she couldn't. She wouldn't. Not yet. Captain. Axton's voice was low, strained. She looked up to see him standing beside her, his face pale, but his eyes clear, focused. He was himself again. Ward, too, had collapsed to the floor beside them, his body twitching, as if the last remnants of the hive's influence were leaving him. His eyes fluttered open, dazed and confused, but there was a flicker of recognition there, a hint of his former self. "We did it," Axton said, his voice filled with a mix of disbelief and awe. "We actually did it." Ilara, still catching her breath, felt a faint smile tug at her lips. She wasn't sure how much time had passed, but the oppressive weight of the entity was gone. The air felt lighter, clearer, and the oppressive psychic pressure was no longer choking her. But even as she began to process the victory, she knew it wasn't over. The obelisk was destroyed, yes, and the entity was broken, but the damage to the planet was already done. The colony's experiments, its role as a prison for the entity, there was no way to undo what had happened here. The planet, though free, was now a hollow shell, a place scarred by the horrors it had hosted for so long. "We can't leave just yet," Ilara said, her voice steady, but filled with a grim resolve. "There's still work to be done. We need to find a way to make sure this never happens again." Axton nodded, his face reflecting the same somber determination. Agreed. But first, we get Ward back. We get ourselves back. Ward's breathing was labored, but he looked up at them, his eyes full of fear and shame. He had been one of them, lost, consumed by the hive. And now he was himself again, but only barely. Ilara. Axton. Ward's voice was raspy. I'm sorry. I didn't know what was happening. I couldn't fight it. I was going to die there. Ilara knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder. You're here now, Ward. That's what matters. She didn't know how much of the Ward she had known would ever return, but right now, it was enough. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ilara felt something other than fear or dread. She felt the smallest glimmer of hope, but that hope, she knew, would be fleeting. They weren't done yet. Not by a long shot. The chamber was still. The vibrations of the obelisk's collapse faded into an eerie silence, but beneath that silence was a sense of unfinished business. The world outside this forgotten place still held its scars. The weight of the years spent under the entity's control was impossible to ignore. Yet, for the first time since they had entered the ruins, Ilara felt a flicker of something like peace. The battle for their minds had been won, but the war for the planet's future had only just begun. Ilara stood up, her body aching from the psychic strain, but she couldn't rest. Not yet. She took a deep breath and looked down at Ward, still recovering from the torment he'd endured. He blinked up at her, his expression still dazed but more focused than it had been when the entity's grip was tight around his soul. He wasn't fully himself yet, but the glimmer of recognition was enough. Ilara. It's okay, Ilara said, cutting him off. Her voice was soft, but there was a determination beneath the surface. We'll get you back. We'll get all of us back. Together. Ward swallowed, nodding slowly. I don't know how to fix what I did, but I'll try. I owe you all that much. You'll have your chance, Ilara assured him. For now, we have to figure out how to undo the damage. The entity might be gone, but this place, she gestured around the chamber, her gaze sweeping over the shattered obelisk and the decaying walls. This place is just the beginning of a much larger problem. The damage to the planet, to the infrastructure. It's going to take more than just a few of us to heal it. Axton, who had been standing off to the side, lost in thought, finally spoke up. His voice was low, measured. The entity's influence might be gone, but the knowledge it left behind, its connection to the colony's tech, it's still here. If we don't shut it down, there's a chance it could spread again, even without the hive. We can't leave any trace of this behind. Ilara nodded. He was right. They had only scratched the surface. The ruins were a symptom of something much deeper, something that had been festering for centuries. They needed to find the heart of the operation, the last remnants of the colony's sinister experiments, and ensure it never had a chance to rise again. Ward, still sitting up, rubbed his forehead, trying to clear the disorientation from his mind. I can help, he offered, his voice tinged with guilt but also determination. I know parts of the system. I was part of it. Maybe I can get us into the central control hub, find out where the last of the tech is hidden. It might help us shut it all down for good. Axton turned toward him, raising an eyebrow. You're sure you can trust yourself after everything? Ward hesitated for a moment, looking at the floor as though he were trying to find something inside himself. Then, slowly, he nodded. I don't know how much of the me that I was is left, but the hive didn't get everything. I remember enough to help. I can do this. Ilara looked between them both, weighing their words. She knew there were still risks, still dangers lurking in the shadows of the colony's twisted past. But they had already come so far. She wasn't about to back down now. All right then, Ilara said, her voice steady. We go together. We find the central hub. We make sure that everything, all of it, gets wiped out. No more experiments. No more control. The three of them set out through the dark corridors, moving with purpose now. The heavy silence that had once pressed in on them was gone, replaced by an unspoken unity. There was still work to be done, but the threat of the hive, the entity, was no more. They had reclaimed their minds, their futures. As they navigated deeper into the bowels of the colony, Ilara's thoughts wandered, but not to the past. She wasn't thinking about the horrors they had just endured. She was thinking about the future. She had no illusions that the road ahead would be easy, but for the first time, she felt that it was possible. The ruin that once seemed insurmountable was now just a series of obstacles to overcome, and she wasn't going to let the scars of this place define them. They reached the central hub, a massive room that looked as if it had once been the heart of the colony's operations. The walls were lined with dormant consoles, tubes, and devices, silent, cold, lifeless. The hum of the entity's presence was gone, but the remnants of its design still lingered, a reminder of the darkness that had nearly consumed them all. Ward walked over to the main terminal, his fingers hovering over the interface. His hands were still shaky, but there was a fire in his eyes now, a determination to make things right. Slowly, cautiously, he began inputting commands, and with each keystroke, the dormant systems flickered to life. "This should work," Ward said quietly, unlocking down the system, cutting off any external connections. "There's no way for any part of the hive's network to reconnect from here." Ilara stood at his side, watching him with cautious hope. "Good. Make sure everything is wiped. There can't be any backups, no traces left." Ward nodded, his face hardening with focus. "No traces. This ends now." The central hub systems began to power down, the screens going black one by one as the entity's control finally disintegrated. And as the last of the colony's corrupted technology shut off, a heavy weight lifted from Ilara's chest. The nightmare was over. They had won. And for the first time, Ilara felt the weight of that victory, the promise of a future free from the shadows of the past.